Okay. I, Good evening.
Good evening.
Evening.
Good evening. We will start at past. I hope you're not all too hot.
Yes, very. Roasted.
Good evening. We will start at past. I hope you're not all too hot.
Yes, very.
Roasted.
Fundraisers for Maui Humane Society.
Good evening, everyone. We are streaming to YouTube, so anything you say or do on screen, if you're not muted, will be heard. And if you've got your picture showing, you will be seen if you're making a noise.
What am I going to do now?
Good evening, everyone. We will start at past. At the moment, we're just admitting people. You should all be muted.
Yeah. It's the lady that's organising.
Somewhere down here. There.
That's mute.
Yes, so click on it to mute, left.
Good evening, everyone. We will start in a couple of minutes. We're still admitting people. You should all be muted.
Why is it not working?
It is working, Jackie Bryant. We can hear and see you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
I will mute you though. And does Claudie have their hand up, or are you just playing with the settings?
Playing with the settings, sorry.
Good evening, everyone. We still have people joining. So we may have to leave it another minute, just so people don't miss the introduction.
The next step. Oh,
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you this evening to Andrew Durham's talk. He's a Cambridgeshire beekeeper who's talked to us before on 2 of the Asian Hornet conferences, and he writes for BBK News on the Asian hornet situation in France. Part 2 of his talk is tomorrow, so you're all very welcome to join that too. Tonight's briefing will take about an hour and will be followed by a Q&A. So if you put your questions in the chat, we'll go through them at the end. So over to Andrew.
Okay, Diane, thank you very much. Let me share my screen just to make sure we've got the right thing up on the screen.
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Well, good evening, and thank you to the BBKA for inviting me to talk to you in this Asian Hornet Week 2023. You may have read an article by me in the current issue of the BBKA News, in which I pose what to some must now seem a fairly redundant question: how long can our luck last with the Asian Hornet? Well, with 37 nests in 30 locations as of today, I guess our luck has run out. But what you don't know is that I wrote that article at the beginning of June and it had to be held over. It's a fundamental mistake to think that the Asian Hornet is only a problem for beekeepers, because it misjudges the impact that this invasion is going to have eventually on us, not just on beekeepers, but on everyone. So tonight is all about understanding the situation, and of course we'll be looking at bees and beekeeping along the way. This brief will last for just under an hour. I'm aiming for 50 minutes, and then we'll take questions at the end. Can I just point out that most of the images in this briefing have very specific copyright permissions attached, so please don't be tempted to copy this yourselves and then republish the material. Now, in part 1 tonight, I will look at how the situation developed in France, the hornet's effect on bees and beekeeping. We will look at the conditions that favour the hornet, and we'll see how that relates to this country. Tomorrow, we look in detail at defences against the hornet. Now, for any who are tempted to bail out now and just come back tomorrow, be aware that I won't be recapping any of this tomorrow. And if you don't get this understanding tonight, then you'll only have the what and the how tomorrow and not the why and the when. Starting then with the potential scale of the problem, because that's the first thing that we need to appreciate. And we don't have to go far to see that. Opposite us on the other side of the English Channel is the Normandy department of Manche, highlighted here on the graphic in red. It has the same area as Devon. It normally destroys 4,000 Asian hornet nests a year, and they're just the ones that are reported. In the Normandy region as a whole, they normally destroy around 11,000 nests, but that is only half the number that are destroyed in the region of Brittany, shown here in yellow. Now, Brittany and the western part of Normandy are in what, for simplicity, I will call the southern zone, and that includes the Channel Islands. We will look at these zones later on. The rest of Normandy and the other region opposite us across the Channel, the Hauts de France, shown here in purple, is currently sitting in what I will call the northern zone. Nest densities in the northern zone are much lower than the southern, but nonetheless, the number of reported nests is rising in that zone each year, and the hundreds of nests reported in each department every year can become thousands in the years in which there is a surge in numbers. Now, last year, 2022, was just such a surge year, and we are seeing the repercussions of that right now. 2022 saw a doubling of nests right across France. There were 10,000 nests in that department of Manche alone. Departments that had been relatively untroubled by the hornet were reporting significant predation on their honeybee colonies. These surge years are happening more often. We'll look at what causes a surge year when we look at the hornet's nests. Now, 4,000 nests, 10,000 nests, it's very hard to visualize what that actually means in an area as large as the equivalent of the county of Devon. So I'm going to try and put this into context. You are looking at Letchworth, just outside of London. A couple of 100 miles to the south of Letchworth lies another town of almost identical size, Vere, in the Normandy department of Calvados, where the D-Day landings took place. It sits on the border between the two zones. So let's get a feel for the scale of this. If you look carefully, you can make out the ring road to the east, the railway lines snaking its way across through the middle, the industrial estates on the northern side of town, the racetrack shows up, and it's very obvious. Even the Pierre Comte Athletic Stadium sitting between them stands out. Eric Germont is a local AHAT referent. He's the man they send out to verify Asian hornet nest reports, and he is pointing to his map of Veer and to the 115 Asian hornet nests destroyed in 2020. That is a nest density of around 12 nests per square kilometre, or a square that's just over half a mile by just over half a mile. 10 to 12 nests per square kilometre is a very typical figure for built up areas in Brittany and Normandy, and it can be much higher. For more than 9 years now, I have been keeping a close watch on the Asian hornet situation in France. Naturally, I pay careful attention to the French département nearest to the UK, and now I'm also looking at Belgium. I started my research in apiaries and speaking to beekeepers at markets, but it soon became clear to me that I needed a wider perspective. Although individual experiences are always interesting, one can never be sure how representative they are. For example, you may have read an article in the August issue of the BBKA News from a Brittany bee farmer in the Côte d'Or department, who reported 70% colony losses. That was very worrying. But to what extent were those losses due to the Asian hornet, and were those losses representative of the wider situation? I found that I get a good view of what's happening from the departmental beekeeping associations, the equivalent of our county associations. And one of those is the Côte d'Or. In a previous year, Philippe Jouin, the president of the association, pictured here, reported losses of around 10% as directly attributed to the Asian hornet. But last December, he reported losses before winter of 30%, due, he said, to the hornet's predation and a drought. Then a national survey of honeybee colony losses gave a winter loss rate of 45% for bee farmers with over 50 hives in the Côte d'Or. By the way, hexagon, if you've noticed it on that paper on the screen, is colloquial French for mainland France. So while 70% may indeed be representative for a bee farmer in that department, I have to tell you that the Côte d'Or had the 4th highest winter loss rate in that category of beekeeper of all departments in mainland France, and there are almost 100 of them. And it was significantly higher than those departments immediately adjacent to it that had the same or higher levels of hornet infestation. And it was also higher than the losses suffered by hobby beekeepers in the same department. So as the bee farmer himself suggested, there may be more to his losses than just the hornet, and so that is not a representative figure. I also get reports from the entirely separate bee health associations, the GDSAs, whose function is comparable to that of our bee inspectors. Just look at what this GDSA newsletter was saying earlier in the year. The mistake would be to believe that solutions will always be found by others. And all this ties in with information from the departmental nest destruction campaigns managed by a national pest and disease organisation. The reports you're seeing are all happen to be from Brittany and Normandy. We can often see where the nests are in the department, right down to the level of the commune. To get a national overview, I subscribe to 3 national beekeeping organisations in France. The main French beekeeping union, UNAF. I quoted the president of UNAF in my recent article. That is their current guide for communes dealing with the Asian hornet. You see it on screen now. The National Bee Farmers Syndicate, the SNA. So as well as any articles that they publish on the hornet, I get a national perspective each month from Frank Elatrue's editorial. He's the president of the French Bee Farmers Syndicate and in fact the European Bee Farmers Union. And the National Organization of Bee Health Groups. As you might expect, they keep members up to date with the latest news on the Asian hornet. Finally, there are the research papers on the hornet. There are now more than 200, but I restrict myself to those relevant just to beekeeping. You'll see the references to those papers coming up on screen throughout the presentation. And then there is information from bodies such as France Agrimaire that reports each year on honey production. And I've just mentioned the ESA survey on honeybee colony losses. This briefing, therefore, is a collation and distillation of all these regularly updated and authoritative sources of information. We start by looking a little closer at the Asian hornet, and don't confuse it with two other Asian hornets. The giant Asian hornet Vespa mandarinia on the far right, recently renamed as the northern giant hornet. But on the far left is another giant Asian hornet called Vespa sorrow. These two giant hornets are frequently confused in the press with the much smaller Asian hornet, Vespa velutina, the yellow-legged hornet known in France as the frelon asiatique. The two giant hornets, with their huge size, powerful jaws, and thick exoskeletons, make direct mass attacks on the honeybee hive, and that is their main method of attack. It is these hornets that can take out a hive in a matter of minutes, but fortunately they are not in the UK, nor are they in France. The smaller yellow-legged hornet, Vespa velutina, is a solitary hawker that uses its aerial agility to hawk bees in preference to the direct attack. That gives us beekeepers some rather different problems. Now, just to compare Vespa velutina to our European hornet Vespa crabrow, Vespa velutina is smaller, but its nests are 3 to 4 times more populous, and there are far more of them. Furthermore, Vespa velutina nests are usually in the open, whilst Vespa crabrow nests are usually under cover. So you are far more likely to stumble across an Asian hornet nest than you are a European hornet nest. It all started in 2004 when a batch of pottery from China was delivered to a garden centre just outside Villeneuve-sur-Lot in the Lot-et-Garonne department. Now, unbeknown to them, it housed a hibernating Asian hornet queen, but the hornet wasn't detected until November of the following year when an amateur entomologist, Jean-Pierre Bouget, was in his garden near Nerac, some 30 miles away. Jean-Pierre was surprised to see a very odd-looking wasp eating the fruit of a persimmon. He didn't recognize it as a local species, so he sent evidence of his find to the National Museum of Natural History, who confirmed that it was Vespa velutina, a hornet from Asia, present for the first time in France and in Europe. Unfortunately, they didn't know the impact that the hornet was to have. There was very little published information about it, and so there were no alarm bells ringing and no real attempt to do anything about it. But the hornet had actually arrived in an area of France that was to prove very favourable to it. This is the Périgord, very reminiscent of the rolling countryside of the South Downs. Please think again if you think the hornet won't like it in the south of England. The hornet quickly spread, and by 2011, 2012, it was well into Brittany and Normandy. Hornets had also hitchhiked to the French Department of the North and southern Belgium, but at that time conditions were not right for them, and so they petered out. Now, hitchhiking is just one of the ways that the hornets could be getting here, but the hornet can easily fly the distance across the channel from northern France. It doesn't make any difference to the outcome whether they overwinter here or in France, so let's not get snared in that debate. And whilst they may be flying over with a favourable wind behind them, perhaps it's more likely that they're actually following olfactory clues and borne across against the wind coming from the northwest. Otherwise, why would they head out to sea? We don't know. In the years followed, the hornet has spread to every French department. It has gone across into Italy and Switzerland, down into Spain and Portugal, and up into Belgium and Holland, and has even been found in Germany and Switzerland. And all from one hibernating hornet queen that was accidentally brought over. For the past 8 years, it has been trying to get established here. So far, it hasn't succeeded. So colonized is not the correct term for us. This, incidentally, is a map that is regularly updated. That was 2 days ago by the Muséum National de la Histoire Naturelle, who is the French government's chief advisor on the hornet. One of the things that we as a family love to do in France is to go to the weekly street markets. And that's us, bottom left, in Chablis for a Sunday market in 2017, which is where you will always find some beekeepers selling their honey. Once you introduce yourself as a beekeeper, they're very willing to talk to you, even if I only speak pidgin French. And at that time, I discovered that the hornet wasn't a big problem in that area. It was only just coming into the department. But what was interesting was that they really didn't know what they were going to do about it. When it did get there and get established, it was these conversations at markets that prompted me to start writing articles and giving talks to BBKA members. Nowadays, there's a bit of a problem with outdoor markets. Stalls like these fruit stalls find that they have hornets feasting on the soft fruit. And as for the fish and meat stalls, they are even worse. In some areas, they have been driven indoors. The hornet has become a major pest, ruining fruit harvests and stinging pickers. The wine industry is hard hit because apart from the risk to the pickers, just a single bite from a hornet into a grape skin allows in grape rot. For anyone working in agriculture or just those cutting verges or even the hedges in their garden, the hornet can be a real nuisance. Spanish researchers are very concerned that the hornet is affecting pollination as a whole. This study from Galicia in northern Spain, they too are concerned about their grape harvests. It's a problem that they report is growing with each year. But interestingly, the report reported even more people in the local community getting stung. A paper that caused a big change in thinking was one published by the MNHN, the French government's advisor, as I've just told you. It reported that a single Asian hornet nest consumes the equivalent in weight of 11 kilograms of other insects in just one season. That report, on top of a 5-year study, completely changed the official position on selective spring trapping of foundress queens in the vicinity of apiaries. People have had to get used to streets in towns being closed off while nests are destroyed. Bottom left, this sports area was closed off while they got a nest destroyed. There have been some very unfortunate incidents involving footballs and the like going into hedges where there are hornets' nests. Fun runs and cycle group rides have come to grief. The emergency services have had to race to the scene to sort out the casualties caused by these Asian hornet attacks. Now, beekeepers are going to have to know the Asian hornet's seasonal cycle as well as they know that of their bees, or they won't understand what is happening in the apiary, nor will they know when it will happen and to what intensity. Furthermore, if you understand what factors impact on that hornet cycle, you'll be able to foresee what's about to happen and not get caught by surprise. We'll start in the autumn, the purple sector. This is when the hornet's nest is at its peak, and over the autumn, it progressively switches from producing workers to producing sexuals, a process that is at its height in October and is complete by early November. Over 1,000 sexuals are produced by an average nest. Those sexuals fly off to mate, and the mated queens spread out to find new territory before going into hibernation for winter, where they will hibernate under leaf litter, under tree bark, under caravanning awnings, in vegetable crates, lorry canvases. That's one of the ways they're getting here. Although researchers tell us that less than 10% make it through winter, probably less than 5%. The nest is destroyed by the winds and the weather over winter. It's only used for one season. The foundress queens, as they are now called, emerge at different times throughout the spring. During the first 10 to 12 weeks of their life, the foundress queens are on their own and vulnerable. The first nest, the nid primaire, is always under cover and hanging down from something like a shed roof or a veranda or in an electricity meter cupboard. And if you're looking for nid primaires, you will usually find them where last year's nests were located. So if you do find one, remember where it was for next year. The nid primaire grows in size, but the hornets usually relocate at the interim stage when the bulk of the workers move off to build a secondary or main nest, and they will be joined by the queen and remaining workers when the new nest is ready. So if you find a nest with no eggs or queen, the chances are the real nest is nearby. Scientists estimate that of those that survive winter, only about 1 in 9 emergent foundress queens actually founds a full-size colony. Over the summer, the number of worker hornets increases and the nest grows in size until we come again to the autumn. Now, predation on hives builds slowly from July, when you will see the first Asian hornet workers in your apiary, but note that from September, end of August, there is a very marked increase in predation in the apiary. And do not overlook the fact that the hornet can be active in October and November. Those can be particularly dangerous times for our bees. So here we have a foundress queen starting her nid primaire. Takes about a week or so to get to this stage. Once the initial batch of workers has been produced, they expand the nest to a secondary or main nest. These are normal-sized Asian hornet nests. And by the way, that nest on the right is the one from Rayleigh in Essex last year. Now, in a year when conditions are poor for the hornet, there will be fewer nests which develop later, and so will be smaller. But of course, the reverse applies in a good year for the hornet, which is when you can get huge nests such as this one. So what causes a surge year? Take 2021. Not a very good year for the hornet. Nest numbers were markedly down, but an unusually mild winter meant that many more hibernating queens survived to emerge in 2022. An early and warm spring got the emerging queens off to a good start. No frosts, so more first nests survived. So that's what you need to take into account. And the signs earlier that year that they were in a surge year, well, the Luke collectives were warning of unusually early reports, higher nest numbers for that time of year, and predation in the apiary started a month earlier than normal. Those were the warning signs that it was going to be a rough year. Beekeepers need to recognize when a surge year is happening because they need to strengthen their defenses. And they need to take that into account in the management of the bees. We'll look at this in more detail tomorrow. The triple whammy comes when summer is followed by an extended and warm autumn. You don't get any more nests, but they grow bigger and more populous. And so you get more foundress queens produced. More foundress queens into hibernation, and particularly in 2022, inevitably meant more were going to emerge in 2023. A surge year is usually followed by a drop in numbers, but this year we started with record numbers of queens. We must hope for a normal autumn and winter. I was looking today at the situation across in Normandy and in Brittany, and it's varied. Some places that had frosts have seen numbers starting to go back to a normal level. Those that didn't have the frosts are seeing the same level of nests as they did last year at this time. That's not a good portent for the autumn. Okay, now early on in the invasion, the nests were very high up in trees. Unless you happen to be a tree surgeon, people were not coming into conflict with the hornet. But now the nests are not just in trees, they are amongst people. This is the report for the Department of Morbihan in Brittany in 2022. And you can see from this report that they like houses and outbuildings more than they like trees. And they are much lower. Almost 60% of the nests were below 5 meters last year. And in 2021, it was nearer 70%. And that's important because whilst the hornet is not aggressive away from the nest, within 5 meters of a nest, it can be very aggressive indeed and will quickly make a mass attack if it feels threatened. By the way, if the weather is poor, the hornets nest lower and closer to houses, and they are definitely more tetchy. Now, some departments have been very successful in stabilizing hornet nest numbers. This is the Department of Morbihan again, and it's a department that's unusual because as well as carrying out nest destruction on a departmental-wide scale, it also carries out large-scale spring trapping to the end of May. The hornet, as you can see, arrived in the department in 2011, just 4 reported nests. There was no organized campaign. See just how quickly the problem grew. This is a department that is the equivalent size again of Devon. The Loot Collective started in 2015. We start to see a slight slowing in the rate of increase with the implementation of spring trapping and a marked decrease the following year. And they were catching tens of thousands of queens in the spring trapping campaign. As 2016 was a surge year for the hornet, that 5,000 reported nests is really quite an achievement. 2017, in contrast, was a poor year for the hornet. 2018 was one of those surge years again, in fact, a major surge year, but at 4,000 nests, only a modest increase in Morbihan, so clearly something was working. If I give you the figures for the 2 departments of equal size sitting next door to Morbihan, but that only do nest destruction, Île-et-Vilain to the east reported 6,200 nests and Finisterre to the west 7,400. 2019 was a poor year for the hornet. Nest numbers were generally down everywhere. 2020, a bit of a recovery, but in Morbihan, they were back to 2015 levels. 2021, very quiet indeed across France. Beekeepers were beginning to wonder where the hornet had got to. But then, of course, we had 2022 when numbers shot up. In Morbihan, though, they only went back up to 2016 levels, and that's a real success. If we look at Île-et-Vilain next door, 8,000 nests. Finisterre was even higher at 8,981. Now, of course, with all these nests, people were getting stung. Over half of people were getting multiple stings, which is defined as 3 or more stings. But to describe the hornet as a killer is overstating it. Let's have a closer look at this report from Monch for 2022. Last column on the right, 384 people reported being stung by the Asian hornet. 11 people got more than 10 stings, and 1 unlucky person got the maximum 30 stings. Well, the maximum for that year is what I really mean to say. But nobody in Monch was reported as suffering from projected venom. That's where the substance is projected into the eyes. No one was reported as suffering anaphylactic shock, and nobody died. Furthermore, there is an element to the venom that seems to lower blood pressure and a degree of toxicity. So multiple stings over 10 need medical management. Sadly, there are those that do die every year from the sting of the Asian hornet. Often the victim's health is compromised in some way, but of course that doesn't make it any less tragic to those affected. I have selected just 2. In June this year, the Calvados department lost a former mayor of Tilly-sur-Seulles to the Asian hornet, and this was widely reported by a number of newspapers, including La Renaissance. Olivier Cano was an AHAT referent for the department's Loot Collective or Collective Nest campaign, and he had gone to a house to confirm a nest when he and the family there suffered a mass attack. He suffered multiple stings. Despite the best efforts of the emergency services, died shortly after. It turns out he had heart problems. But it's not always so obvious. Last year, 2022, beekeepers mourned the loss of Christine Dutoit, a very well-known beekeeper in the Pas-de-Calais department, whose death was reported by the Voix du Nord newspaper. Frank Alitrou, who I remind you is president of the SNA, mentioned her death in his editorial in L'Abbaye. She had reported an Asian hornet nest nearby, but was actually stung in her garden by a single hornet while collecting leaves. Unfortunately, she had a systemic reaction to the venom and died of anaphylaxis. Spanish researchers are very worried about the number of anaphylactic reactions to Vespa velutina stings, which are by far the leading cause of such reactions in northern Spain, almost 80% at one regional hospital, of which half are first-time stings. Now, I've said this before, I do not understand the current assurances that there is no increased risk to human health. How anything that was not present before that is now present and causes people to die, how that can be anything other than an increased risk is, I'm afraid, beyond me. We're now going to look at the interaction between the hornet and the honeybee. We need to understand what is happening with the bees. The first sign that the beekeeper will see in the apiary is Asian hornets hawking outside the entrance to a hive, and as the attacks intensify, very quickly a beard of bees will be seen outside the entrance. Remember, this hornet prefers to hawk rather than attack a hive directly. That comes later, which is why it's known as a solitary hawker, and they return to their nests at dusk. What beekeepers need to pay particular attention to is that the hornet is not in the apiary by chance. It is actively searching for concentrations of its prey. It is attracted by the smell of pollen in the brood box, honey, and in fact the bee's own Nasonoff gland pheromone, by which the bee marks the entrance to its hive. And once the apiary is found, the hornet learns waymarks to find it again, so a high number of hornets will be return visitors. It's very important that beekeepers do all they can to maintain a low olfactory signature in the apiary. We'll look at this more tomorrow in the section on apiary defences. What I'd like you to do now is focus on the effect of the hornet's predation on the honeybee, because some of the effects are hidden, and it is these that can cause real problems. As predation builds over the summer, the response of the honeybee colony is to reinforce the guard bees. The colony starts to get very stressed. What a 4-year study found was that in addition to the obvious losses caused by hawking, there was a reduction in foraging corresponding with the number of hornets simultaneously in front of the hive. What the study found was 4 hornets, a 40% reduction, 6, 60%, more than 12, there's no foraging at all. Now, I have to say that the general view nowadays is that total foraging paralysis comes in much earlier than this report found, perhaps as low as 4 hornets always in front of the hive. But the bees stay in the hive, consuming stores and getting ever more stressed. I cannot overemphasize just how important this stress factor is. In the absence of food coming in, the colony will take the queen off lay. but they may also kill her. The organization and cohesion of the colony starts to collapse, and September or even October absconding is not unusual in heavily predated areas. But there was one very important factor that the researchers could not investigate. They said so in their paper. This graphic is from Randy Oliver over in the States, so the flow calendar's not quite right, but it will serve our purpose very well. Reds and yellows are summer bees, blues and purples are winter bees, the bees with the longer lifespan that are essential for the survival of the colony over winter. The dotted line running across the left to right, highlighted by the red arrow, shows the brood development over the course of the year. Now, we will all recognize the spring peak and then the build up for the main flow. We will also recognize the post-flow drop in brood production. And then there's that last peak, which is what Professor Heather Matilla's research identified. That is when the production of the winter bees happens or is supposed to happen, and it happens in a very brief period coinciding with the period of maximum predation by the hornet with its paralysis of the hive. And that is why it is in winter that colony losses from the hornet are often highest. To summarize the hornet's predation, 2 methods of attack: hawking, and the possibility of a direct attack on weakened hives in the autumn. Predation starts from a low level in July, but a significant increase in late August, September, and it can continue into November. Predation weakens the colony, but it is not that which usually kills it. Starvation, of course, you, the beekeeper, can do something about that, and hopefully didn't take all the honey off at the end of July and leave them with no stores. Don't underestimate the effect of stress on the bees, leading to colony collapse, absconsion, or regicide. Stress and not enough winter bees are 2 hidden effects that we, the beekeepers, have to address. Now, it's because of the stress factor that the French National Bee Health Association urges beekeepers to use solid floors and to be very cautious about opening the hive during the period of foraging paralysis. Beekeepers need to get intensive hive manipulation out of the way before the hornet's predation in the apiary builds to become a problem. Typically, that's by the beginning of August. Last year, it was at the beginning of July, which caused some real problems. In the period of predation, hive manipulations need to be minimized, and if required, done very early in the morning or just before dusk. Well, I hope I've given you an insight into the potential scale of the problem, the reality of living with the hornet, and its hidden effects on the honeybee colony. Now I want to talk about the hornet in beekeeping as a whole, but to what extent is the hornet responsible for honeybee colony losses? Well, first, let's look at the factors behind honeybee colony mortality in France. I have listed here the main causes. They come from a report by the French Senate in 2017 and pretty much mirror an earlier government report by ANSES in 2012. Pathogens, pesticides, and Varroa are the top 3 concerns. Furthermore, climate change has had a drastic effect on the summer nectar flow in many parts of France. Until last year, the hornet was a second-tier concern, but let's not overlook the effect of poor apicultural practices. It's just that much more difficult to keep the bees alive. And as the National Institute for Agricultural Research was keen to emphasize, all these factors are cumulative. 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. 1 + 1 increases the problem by a factor of 10. Now, if we look at the interim results of a survey carried out each year into honeybee colony mortality, only some beekeepers answered this part of the survey. They were asked to identify the primary cause of their colony losses. As you might expect, given the surge year, there is an unusually high attribution to the Asian hornet. Only bee farmers with more than 200 colonies thought that Varroa was more responsible for the losses than the hornet. But look at the other reasons given by the beekeepers. By far the biggest cause was colonies too weak to overwinter. Now, was that because the beekeeper had taken off the honey and they had no stores, or had they been reduced in number by predation, or had the colony failed to produce its winter bees? We just don't know. And queen problems, the blue column, features highly, and that can be down to several causes, including hornet predation. Can we directly link colony mortality with the Asian hornet? Well, these are the figures for colony losses over the winter of 2017 into 18, and there's a reason that I have picked that winter that will become apparent in a moment. Note they include dead and queenless colonies, or colonies that were just not viable. The national average loss for the winter of 2017 into 18 was 30%, with some departments over 40%. In a country used to far lower losses, these figures really hit the headlines. The weather in 2017 had been very difficult indeed for the bees, and it was also difficult for the Asian hornet. There were far fewer nests in that year. If I overlay in white the departments we know were most affected by the hornet at that time, not only is there a large variation between departments in areas affected by the hornet, many of the higher losses are in areas that were not seriously affected by the hornet, and therefore they have to be predominantly down to the other factors. The following year, 2018, if you recall, was a huge surge year for the hornet. So if the hornet is a major factor, the figures for the winter of 2018 into 19 will be much worse. But they are actually much lower. The answer is you cannot directly link winter losses directly to the hornet. It's a multifactorial situation, and every part is playing a role. Focusing on that article from the bee farmer in the Côte d'Or, we can see from the ESA survey, where a total of 237 beekeepers in that department responded, that those beekeepers with over 50 hives were reporting 45% losses, as I said earlier, the fourth highest in the country. But look at the losses in adjacent departments. And if we look at the ones with up to 11 hives, the hobby beekeepers, they suffered less. But what drew my attention were the winter losses in the east and in the north, where many hobby beekeepers got their first real taste of intense hornet predation and were caught by surprise and unprepared. Now, as that GDSA newsletter suggested, many beekeepers are waiting for the scientists to come up with an answer. These solutions have all been muted by the scientists in France that are very worried about the side effect of indiscriminate trapping, especially by the general population. Fungi and nematodes have been suggested, but INRA tell us, that's the National Institute for Agricultural Research, that it wouldn't affect enough hornets to make a meaningful difference, and other scientists are understandably very reluctant to see the introduction of something over which they may not have control. Sarracenia pitcher plants are often mentioned by the Muséum National de l'Histoire Naturelle. They are attractive to the hornet, but the maximum number of insects found in one plant was 7, being slowly digested. You'd have to plant an awful lot in the apiary to make any difference. And of course, they're not selective, so I'm surprised the MNHN even mentioned it. European honey buzzards have been observed to attack hornet nests, and people are starting to talk about that as a possible solution. But of course, here in the UK, we only have 40 breeding pairs, mostly living around the coast. The current favourite is a pheromone trap that attracts the male hornets. The theory is fine. They have isolated a pheromone to attract the male sexuals in the autumn, but they've encountered problems with the lures, and it's untested in the field on any practical scale. So perhaps they're not as optimistic as they were. By the way, the traps being muted only use the pheromone to get the hornet to the trap. It still has to have a sweet bait to get them into it in that bottom container. So it's perhaps not as selective as people think it is. They'll have to find another trap. There is some discussion on using the hornet's alarm pheromone to repel the hornet, but remember that predation doesn't happen just in front of the hive, and I can well imagine the bees might not like having the hornet's alarm pheromone sprayed on the front of their hive either. The fact is, all these are quick fixes conjured up by scientists desperate to find a promised alternative to trapping, but I'm afraid at the moment there's nothing that's immediately on the horizon. Okay. Last section of the talk then, and a fairly brief one. Up to this point of the talk, I've tried to give you an idea of the scale of the problem, the realities of living with the hornet. We've looked very briefly at the effectiveness of the collective nest destruction campaign. $64,000 question is, what can we expect here on the mainland UK? Okay, well, back to that map of the hornet spread, and it begs the question, if the hornet is established across the channel, why hasn't it managed to get established here before now? Well, essentially, there are three factors at play. The first factor is, how favourable is our climate to the Asian hornet? The next factor is a rather unpredictable one, because it is the weather in the year that the hornet arrives or emerges from hibernation that's the single biggest factor in any year. The last factor is all about the actual number of hornets arriving here. The chances of the hornet becoming established then is a combination of these factors. Well, if we have a quick look at them. This is a French computer model that was made up in 2016, and it is showing the favorability of areas to the hornet. Well, not surprisingly, it is actually showing the actual nest densities in France as of 2016. We know that from the Loop collectives. The areas in bright yellow were the most favorable, and then the favorability drops off as we go through the greens and the blues. Anything in dark blue or purple was considered to be too marginal for the hornet. Hasn't quite worked out that way, but let's see what's behind this. We need to understand that France is divided east-west by a spine of high ground running south to north. To the east, the climate is dominated by the continent, and to the west, it's dominated by the Atlantic, and that includes us. On the Atlantic side, we have a further distinction, the maritime south and the maritime north. These zones are defined by the European Environment Agency. By 1995, the transition between the two maritime zones lay here. But by 2016, it had moved northeast to include all of Brittany and the western part of Normandy, and is touching the far south of the UK, ideal for the Asian hornet. If I overlay that model for 2016 to see where the nest densities were at the time that this is talking about, you can see a very clear correlation between the maritime south and the areas of maximum density. The problem is that zone is still moving northeast. Now, I would think it would be quite reasonable to think of the south and southeast of England as being comparable to central and western Belgium. The model is certainly suggesting that, and I think common sense tells us that's the case as well. So let's have a look at what's happened in Belgium. This is the official website for Wallonia, the southern or French-speaking part of Belgium, the area of Belgium below the red line. We are interested in the dark blue and light blue dots, which are the nests. Starting in 2016, if you see any orange dots, ignore them, they're sightings of individuals. We're now in 2017, 18, 19, this is the small persistent population that I wrote about in my update articles in the BBKA News. 2020, 2021, and then 2022. This is what happens in a surge year. And as this is the end of year situation report, far too many of those nests are in dark blue, which means they were not destroyed. So they will have produced sexuals for this year. If I do the thing that I did with Letchworth and Veer, this is Mons between Brussels and the French border. I counted 100 nests in a 40 square kilometre area. So that's a density of 2.5 nests per square kilometre. A lot lower density than would be the case in the southern zone in, say, Western Normandy or Brittany, but still enough to pose a real problem for beekeepers. And notice the density is in predominantly urban areas. That does not mean that the hornet is not present in rural areas, just that they haven't reported it. It's very noticeable that a lot of the nests that have been reported are lying along roads near to houses. And if I compare Belgium in 2022 up to the 1st of September with the 1st of September this year, I think it's pretty obvious that so far this year, they have had more nests. The problem is going to continue to grow in Belgium because reports are indicating that they only intend to destroy nests below 5 meters. Now, I have to say that is a singularly stupid thing to do, as the nests they don't destroy will simply make up the numbers the next year. So it will be a never-ending task. And just in case you're curious as to what's happening in northern half of Belgium, that's a different database. I've taken out the sightings of the individual hornets to leave just the nests showing as dots. So it's pretty much the same as southern Belgium as well. We can expect hornet numbers in the north of France and Belgium to continue to grow, sitting in increasing numbers around the European ports that bring in most of our ferry and freight traffic. 4 times the tonnage comes into the London and East Coast ports than comes into the South Coast ports. And by far, the majority of the ferry traffic comes into Kent via Calais and Dunkirk. But they are not just coming as hitchhikers. We can expect more to fly over as the north of France gets more and more populous. So I think we can expect to see a situation similar to Belgium developing here in the short term. Will we get to a situation similar to that of Normandy? Well, I'm guessing, but I think the answer has to be eventually, but that level of infestation is still hopefully some time off. It's very dependent on how fast climate change happens. So what we can do, well, continue doing what we have been doing. I urge you to promote early detection by both beekeepers and the public. It seems to be working very well in Kent at the moment. So I suggest you get your AHAT teams up to strength. When the hornet does get established here and the MBU has to withdraw to an advisory role, that's the plan. I caution against beekeeping associations trying to manage this. It hasn't worked that well across the channel. I believe we need a direct equivalent to the publicly subsidised Loot Collective, and that means an element of public funding. The best thing beekeepers can do at the moment is get educated about the hornet, and when predation is happening in apiaries, to recognise what's happening and respond in proportion to that problem. Tomorrow, we're going to look at defences against the hornet, both in the vicinity of the apiary and in the apiary itself. So it just remains for me to acknowledge the French institutes and associations that have made all this information in the briefing available. Whatever we do, we must not fall into the trap of trying to reinvent the wheel and ignore what the French have found out for us. That would be a tremendous waste of resource. Don't reinvent the wheel because the French beekeepers have already done it for us. And with that, I say thank you for your attention. I'm sorry it's gone on for 55 minutes, perhaps a bit longer than I would have planned. I will stop sharing the screen, and I think Diane's going to see what questions we've got.
I am. Thank you very much, Andrew. That was really excellent. There are a couple of questions that I'll answer. One of them is, how are BBKA and MBU working together? I spoke to Nigel yesterday and I spoke to him last week about different aspects of the issue in Kent. Normally it's been Anne Robury, but if you've seen her welcome video for the start of Asian Hornet Week, she's actually at Tape in Mondia in Chile. We feed into the Bee Health Advisory Forum, as well as communicating regularly with them, and they feed information to the office. So we do work with them as much as we can. The other question was about numbers of nests. We're using the bee units rolling total, which is on the Bee Base website, and they're counting a total number of nests, but in some places breaking it down into primary and secondary nests, but we're just using the total number of nests. So the first question for Andrew is, would you say with 37 nests found so far that the Asian hornet is established in the UK?
I think it's a bit early to say it's established, but I'm not very optimistic that we are going to be able to stop it becoming established, because my suspicion is that for every nest we've discovered, there's probably another one out there somewhere that hasn't been found yet. That question would be better answered, I think, in October, November time. Over on the continent, if we look at the profile of nest reports, far more nests are discovered when the leaves drop. So if they are up in trees or hiding in bushes, we'll have to wait to see what's there.
Thank you. There's a question, why is nest density so high in urban areas?
Well, the official view is that the hornet finds that there is an island heat effect in the urban areas, and there is plentiful food for it, and it gets shelter against houses, etc. So it's a more sheltered, pardon me, it's a more sheltered environment. However, the Spanish are challenging that. Some Spanish researchers are finding that they have got just as many Asian hornets in their countryside as they have in their urban and suburban areas, and so they're wondering where this idea has come from. The problem in France is that, more than in the UK, large parts of rural France are very depopulated indeed. And if I can do this with just about any department that is reporting as part of a Loop collective. If I take their nest report maps showing the density of nests that have been reported and destroyed by the campaigns, and superimpose that over a map showing centres of population and density of population, they always coincide. And out in the countryside, there are very few reports and very few nests destroyed. So I think, rather like that map I showed you of Mons, there was a big area there where there were hardly any nests reported. That's a very rural, it isn't actually even true to say it's a heavily farmed area, although lots of Belgium obviously is. I just don't think if there's a nest in the countryside, there's a different kind of thinking, and that thinking is very much, if it's not bothering me, then I won't report it in case I have to pay to have it destroyed.
Thank you. How do people live alongside the hornet successfully in its native environment?
Are you talking about somewhere like Indonesia, Diana?
I think that's what the questioner means, yeah.
Well, of course, in Indonesia, this is now way outside of my very limited sphere of research, but we should remember that in Indonesia, the hornet is a greatly feared insect. So I can't answer it in any more detail because I would be just making it up.
Thank you. Does the nest have a distinct smell that could be used to get dogs to identify where they are?
Don't know. That's never been reported.
And someone asks, how far will they follow in a mass attack, or can you just run away?
Oh, I can answer that one. So a Korean researcher, Moonboo Choi, with a band of kamikaze research assistants, set out to find out, first of all, what would excite a nest to attack them. And the answer was that sudden movements or vibration. If they crept up, they were far less likely to be attacked. if they were attacked, their conclusion was really quite clear. First of all, they said, run, turn and run, and shield your neck and face with your arms and hands, because it is far better to be stung on your arms and hands than it is to get an Asian hornet sting on your soft tissue or on your neck and a core almost direct route into the major organs and blood supply areas. So their conclusion was very definitely run. They tried crouching down, they tried walking away, and they simply took more hornets. If they ran within about 30 meters, almost all but one or two of the hornets had given up chasing them and had gone back to the nest. And by the way, they recommend wearing a broad hat because the hornets will tend to attack the hat. And they also had some recommendations on colours, but they won't come as any surprise to us beekeepers. Don't wear dark colours, wear very light white colours. It seems to excite them less. And that's thanks to Moon Bu Choi and literally a group of researchers who went out with sticks and beat Asian hornet nests to find out what would happen.
Which sort of brings me on to the next question. Will normal bee suits protect against hornet stings?
No. It's a 6 mil sting. There are some, I see the MBU are wearing suits, and I can only assume that they are particularly thick or they've been tested against this, but normally bee suits are not deemed to be adequate. And by the way, it's extremely important that people approaching a nest, if they're in a bee suit, wears eye protection. There was something like, since the Asian hornet's been in France, almost 30 cases of venom being projected into the eyes, which causes people to sort of a lot of pain and discomfort, and at least one fireman fell off his ladder. So now everybody wears eye protection. I was very surprised to see MBU people holding up a nest that didn't actually have eye protection on, so I hope they've remedied that one. It doesn't normally have a lasting effect, by the way. Normally, if the eye is then washed out, it will normally resolve, but it doesn't always.
Thank you. In France, have people stopped keeping bees in their own gardens due to hornets being attracted to the hives and putting beekeepers' children at risk?
I don't know.
Do we know what factors determine whether the hornets will or will not acclimatise to a region? And do you think there will be a northern limit of their spread?
Well, I think we have got the answer to that one. It is a very resilient and adaptable hornet. It moved down out of the trees, I suspect, because the climate in Brittany and Normandy was not conducive to staying up. So it can certainly adapt to other climates. All the scientific reports at the moment are indicating that there is the northern range will be out of Denmark and the rest of it before the hornet finds where it cannot live. The question is the density of nests. And of course, as that maritime south edges its way up all the time, then that is an incredibly favourable area to it. That map I showed you early on that had kind of the different yellows, by the end of the century, the French were predicting the whole map pretty much would be yellow. But of course, that's all accelerating now, and it's happening a lot quicker than I think they realised when they did the report, even in 2016.
Thank you. What other UK insect populations are also under threat from the Asian hornet?
Well, the Asian hornet's diet is very wide and varied, but any of the pollinators, hoverflies, they will take on spiders, moths, the lot. It's not fussy. The ratio of prey to the Asian hornet is, in the countryside, the honeybee is about 30% of the diet, so 70% of its diet is other insects. And in towns, in urban areas, that flips, and it's more like 70% are honeybees, simply because there are less other insects.
Thank you. Have there been any reports of the European hornet changing its behaviour to mimic that of Asian hornet?
Do you know, I thought for a minute you were going to ask whether the European hornet was attacking Vespa velutina, and the answer there is in areas where there's been predation over some time? The answer is yes, they have. And beekeepers reported very early on that they were getting increased predation on honeybee hives by Vespa crabrow, and that's a problem that's getting worse. I read a report recently that they said perhaps in some areas 25% of the attacks are now European hornets. And I'm just going to have to put that down, but I don't know. There's nobody's given us a research on that. I'm going to have to put that down to a lack of other prey.
Thank you. Have the French bees started to ball the hornets?
Yes, early on there's been a lot of comment about the fact that the European honeybee is not capable of balling a hornet successfully. I have to say, all the reports I see is that, especially with the Mosellia that we look at tomorrow, if a hornet gets inside and the bees feel they can attack it without getting picked off by the other hornets, they will ball it and they will kill the hornet. They are very quick learners. And in fact, 4 or 5 years after predation starts and our honeybee starts to realize what it is this strange little insect is all about, that it's an enemy, they learn very quickly. They put out less guard bees and they sort of adapt to it, and they certainly will attack it more.
Thank you. I'm having to scroll past so many messages saying thank you so much for an excellent presentation. I think everyone's really enjoyed it. There is a question about spring trapping, but I know you're going to talk about that tomorrow, so we'll leave that one.
Okay.
This is on YouTube, and tomorrow's will be as well for people to watch. We've had a massive number of people on the talk tonight. I think I've answered all the questions, but thank you so much, Andrew. I'm sure everyone else will join me in saying thank you. That was really, really brilliant.
Well, thank you, Diane. That's and tomorrow we will have a presentation about the same sort of length, and we'll delve into the real detail of defences against the hornet. There just wasn't enough time to put the two together tonight.
No, thank you so much. And
okay.
I will see you tomorrow evening, Andrew, and I'm sure I'll see lots of people again tomorrow.
Thank you very much. And thank you for everybody for your attention.
You.